Welcome to this episode of the Upfront Podcast. As always, I am your host, Nina Mueller, and this is the place where you get your dose of upfront and honest conversations with people from all around the world. Enjoy the show. My guest today is the very eloquent Yirmiyahu, also known as That Semite on social media. Yirmiyahu is an educator and activist for Jewish and Indigenous rights, and this is how I first became aware of his advocacy work. He holds a degree in political science, homeland security, and public diplomacy. Today we are talking about Jewish identity, values, and visibility, our own personal feelings about the hate we are being subjected to as a people, the danger of antisemitism and anti-Jewish caricatures and stereotypes festering and remaining unchecked, as well as about why and how antisemitism differentiates from other forms of xenophobia. Yirmiyahu and I are also addressing the identity crisis and dichotomy of Jewish people in the diaspora, trying to fit in while attempting to reconcile with the increasingly apparent becoming feeling of never truly belonging, what the current situation is like for Jewish students, and we're also addressing even the short-term dangers of aligning ourselves with politically right-wing ideologies due to a supposed solidarity with the Jewish people and Israel as an extension. Yirmiyahu is also speaking on how terminology is a crucial factor of how a narrative is formed, the Jews returning to their ancestral homeland being the most successful project of decolonization, and how the diverse society of Israel, including Muslims, Arabs, and Druze in Israel, are feeling today. Yirmiyahu also speaks directly to our listeners who are parents of Jewish kids about how to talk to them about who and what they are, and why we as Jews owe it to our people and our ancestors to speak up. Hi, Yirmiyahu. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you, Nina?
Perfect, thank you. I'm really excited to have you on this episode of the Upfront Podcast today.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. My pleasure. So to start off, please tell me a bit about yourself.
Sure. So my name is Yirmiyahu, but a lot of people know me as That Semite on social media. I create content on Instagram and TikTok, and now increasingly on Threads. I'm a digital educator for Unpacked, where you can find our long-form content on YouTube that I host. I like to consider myself an educator first and an activist second, because I think that, my favorite tool for changing our reality, for changing our communities, our societies, the international community, is through education. So that's my tool. But I'm, focused and committed on addressing some of the biggest challenges that I see facing the Jewish world today, and all communities that are in relationship with us or that we are in relationship with. And yeah, that's basically me in a nutshell.
So as you alluded to in a very humble way, you are one of the leading educators on the very diverse Jewish people, the history of Israel, intersectional advocacy, and Jewish advocacy. How did you first get into this field of activism, and what was the motivation for you to do so?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that description. But it was this was not, my trajectory. I did not think that this is where I would be at this point in my life. But, looking back in retrospect, it kind of makes sense. From a young age, I was confronted with the full complexity and diversity of Jewish identity. My father comes from a line of Jews that, from what we can trace in our family's history, we've been at least 9 generations in the land of Israel. And my mother is a Caribbean Jewish woman from Guyana, and they met in the U.S. And so what seemed very normal to me in my home was this seamless blend of Israeli culture and Jewish American identity and Caribbean American identity all together. But very quickly, when I ventured out of that bubble of my family life, I realized that wasn't very common, not for American Jews and certainly not for non-Jewish America. And so I found myself in a position at a very young age where I constantly had to be telling the story of the Jewish people, right? It's full complexity. On the one hand, my father's family, which is a testimony to this continuous and undying relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. And on the other side, my mother's family, a testimony to the dazzling diversity of the Jewish people that was created as a result of our exile and diaspora. And so in embodying those two facets, those two pillars of Jewish identity, I found myself putting myself constantly in the forefront of discussions about Jewish identity, about the state of Israel, And, what started as mostly educational very quickly turned into, political and, social justice oriented. And so when I arrived in college campus in the US as, an 18-year-old, I was very much thrust into the very anti-Semitic environment that already existed, then, which is around 10 years ago. And, one thing led to another, and my activism on campuses in the US, really inspired me to, make the move to return home, to return to the land of Israel. So around 10 years ago, I made Aliyah. I moved back to Israel. And I immediately threw myself in the activist sphere here on the ground, grassroots activism.
Mm.
Uh, I taught English at an Arabic school in Jaffa and Yafo. I got involved in, I don't want to call it peace activism, but more like narrative work between Israelis and Palestinians, between Jews and Arabs in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. And so after my military service, where I got to really experience the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for all of its complexity and pain, I continued in that sphere. And then so some of my colleagues that were already creating content on social media was like, hey, you do this pretty well on the ground, face to face with people. Why don't you just record a couple of videos and upload it to TikTok and see what happens? And, after a lot of nudging, I made the leap of faith. And, a couple of viral videos later, and I really, threw myself into it. And I've been doing it now for a little more than a year.
That's amazing. Good for you. And congratulations on your Aliyah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Other people have previously pointed out a lot of other minorities, and of which, by the way, the Jewish people are the very tiny minority. Usually other minorities seem to be much better at speaking up than the Jewish people have been in recent decades, especially. And there's quite a bit of resentment from within me towards some diaspora Jews that have never spoken out about, Israel and the Jewish people before this war began on October 7th. And while in Israel we have come under attack by terrorists time and again, and at least every couple of years, we are being attacked with missiles, and people online are already cheering on Hamas and other terrorists, like dating years back. So I do feel like Jews on a larger scale would have kind of been prone to speaking up before, and the situation now might be very different if they would have done that, which is why I keep bringing this up in these episodes. How do you personally reconcile with this, or what are your feelings towards the situation?
Well, I mean, first, as somebody that teaches history, or a lot of my education has to deal with, going over history and understanding history from, a multitude of perspectives, I can understand it. I get where it comes from. The Jewish people, we've gone through so much. We've been through multiple displacements, multiple genocides, multiple exiles, massacres, subjugation of all kinds. And that's created a lot of trauma. And so one of the prominent expressions of that in diaspora communities throughout the world is that we've had to, fit our identities into convenient categories for the host population that we live. And in the context of the West, of Western Europe and the Americas, that convenient box was the delineation between religion and race. And so basically, after the emancipation, Jews were given the choice. They were given the option to integrate into Western society, into European and Euro-American society, if they would just cast aside their national ethnic characteristics and completely define themselves and self-define within the realm of religion. And so in the Euro-American context, that means being a white person. While a lot of people, most Jews, I would say, have never felt really comfortable in that identification, because most Jews just inherently understand their identity is far older than any of these definitions, and that these limited terms of religion and race just don't fully capture who we are. We've also forgotten how to articulate it in our own language. And I mean that literally, like being able to speak Hebrew, but certainly in the symbolic sense of being able to articulate our story. And so as a result of that, we haven't been able to actually put ourselves forward on the political and socio-political scene as Jews. But what we do know, what we do remember, at least many of us, is our values. And we understand that a central component of Jewish values is standing up for what's right, standing up for justice, demanding justice. And so we've been very willing and involved in the plight of other minority communities. But unfortunately, when it comes to the plight and the struggle for Jewish national liberation, far too many Jews are silent. And a lot of it comes from, number one, intergenerational trauma and discomfort with Jewish identity. And number two, just an inability to actually articulate Jewish identity in Jewish terms.
I agree. And thank you for putting it so eloquently. Do you think this has anything to do with how you pointed out the sort of forced assimilation instead of integration into other societies that we've lived in?
Yeah, I think that Jews have been an enigma to societies going all the way back to Greek-occupied Egypt. And that's not my theory, right? Ben Sion Netanyahu, putting aside however you feel about his son, he wrote an incredible book called The Origins of the Inquisition, where he basically, goes into an incredibly elaborate history of the Spanish Inquisition and its legacy. But before he goes into that history, he addresses what he calls his theoretical framework for understanding anti-Semitism and why anti-Semitism is unique from other forms of bigotry, xenophobia, and racism. And that's that the Jews already in that early period of Greek-occupied Egypt, they were this in-between group. They weren't clear. They certainly were not the native Egyptian population, but they also weren't the Greek settler class. They were something in between. And because they were something in between that, it was very easy to scapegoat them. And we see this from that period, that early period in Egypt, being replicated in countries throughout the world. And unfortunately, starting in the Spanish Inquisition, that scapegoating, that caricature of Jewish identity started to become racialized. And we know that the tragic outcome of that racialization, came to full fruition in the Nazi Holocaust.
Mm. I'm currently located in Paris, and I've seen many non-Jews all over diaspora countries, but also some Jews here in France that believe that being Jewish, they kind of downgraded to being a religion. And I specifically actually use that term downgraded because it doesn't envelop the whole of, our ancestry and history and heritage that we all share. We're a very diverse people, so we don't all share the same exact journeys, but we all share similar struggles and a history and a ancestry in a way. What would you like for people to know about us as a people instead of only a religion, quote unquote?
That's a great question. And I would just start by saying that I think most Jews understand just intuitively that we're not just a religion, or that we're more than just a religion, however you want to put it. Because a lot of people in every Jewish community know Jewish atheists. They know people that believe nothing, that observe nothing, yet they're a part of the Jewish collective. They're a part of the Jewish community. So we understand that it's not just a religion. Anybody that is acquainted with other religious communities, whether it's Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, or otherwise, the second you don't subscribe to the tenets of the faith, you're no longer part of the religious community, right? There's no atheist Christians. There's no atheist Muslims. Yet we know an abundance of very famous atheist Jews, whether they're, scholars or comedians. So I think that we know it intuitively, but we just forgot how to articulate it. And we have to take a step back because we get and this is true for every people, not just Jewish people in this current dispensation. We get very caught up in the current moment. And we think that the way that human beings exist and articulate themselves now in the society that we live in, that's how people always thought, right? And when we describe our ancestors in that way, it's called an anachronism. And so, whenever we talk about Moses or Abraham or the Maccabees or, even the first Jews that are taken as slaves to the shores of Southern Europe or North Africa, when we describe them as a religious community, we're engaging in an anachronism. Because the Jewish people, we've existed before these Greco-Roman terms of religion and race. We are a civilization, perhaps. We're a nation. We're a people. And so I think that the terminology that Jewish academics have come up with to most accurately describe what the Jews are is peoplehood, belonging to a people, because we have a collective memory, we have a shared origin in the land of Israel, we have a shared culture, we have a shared language, and of course, diaspora created so much diversity within that shared culture, within that shared identity, within that shared ethnicity. So we have like micro ethnicities and micro communities within the larger community, but at the end of the day, the connecting points between all of those things is that shared Hebrew, Israelite, Judean culture that we all stem from. So if we look at, for example, the Ashkenazi linguistic cultural expression, which was Yiddish. And then we look at the Judeo-Arabic of a Babylonian, right, Iraqi Jewry. The points that connect them to between the Yiddish and the Judeo-Arabic is the shared Hebrew lexicon, the words, and the idioms that have been inherited through generation to generation. So that's just one example to illustrate how, even though it might seem on the surface level that we are different peoples that just happen to share a same religion, it's certainly not that. It's far more complicated. But that's what is so beautiful, is that we were able to preserve that through certain rituals and holidays and celebrations that we continue to celebrate from generation to generation, remembering that we came from this place called Zion, and then which allowed for us, given various socio-political changes, particularly in the West, but in other places of the world, to create this modern ideology of Zionism, which drew on very ancient ideas to facilitate a mass return back to that homeland, back to that origin.
You're actually bringing up a few very interesting and good points, but another point that I was trying to get to eventually. There is a lot of talk online and, chants and slogans about the misnomer anti-Zionism not being anti-Semitism. Can you speak a bit on that?
Of course, when people ask me if anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, my answer generally is, for the vast majority of cases, it is. But there's obviously a small percentage in which somebody who is against the existence of a Jewish state, because they're against the existence of all nation states, and as long as they're not suggesting that we start with the Jewish state and dismantling all nation states, then I'll grant that person or grant that individual that their anti-Zionism isn't an expression of anti-Semitism. Yet, of course, we know that's not true for the vast majority of cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
Denying the right to the Jewish people to have a nation state when you're perfectly fine with all the other nation states throughout the world, whether it's in the Middle East, North Africa, in Europe, in Asia, that is just pure anti-Semitism, because it subjects Jews to a double standard, and or it demonizes the Jews for engaging in something that is the inherent right of every people.
Speaking of which, how do you personally feel, like you personally, very individually, when people chant about us being white colonizers, speaking of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and erasing the diversity, I guess, of the Jewish people?
Yeah, I think it's erasure, right? When I
Mm,
hear that, they're certainly erasing my family's experience on both sides of my family,
right.
because our experience in the land of Israel, our relationship to the land of Israel, you could say that, okay, you don't get it, but to describe it as a settler colonial relationship or any other type of colonial relationship is, quite frankly, a bastardization of Jewish identity, first and foremost. And it's a great disservice and injustice to the actual painful reality of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, between Arabs and Jews, right? Because this is a complicated conflict, and in fitting it crudely into a definition that might make sense for analyzing the histories and the political realities of the West, it might make you feel good in the West, in your ivory towers, where you're basically just, using the Jewish people as a convenient testing ground for your own dreams of decolonization in America or in New Zealand or Australia or wherever. But it doesn't do anything for actually helping the peoples on the ground. It certainly doesn't help Israeli Jews, and it definitely doesn't help Palestinian Arabs. Because if you're encouraging the Palestinians to fight this phantom, this caricature, this fantasy of what the Jewish people are in this land, then they're not going to have any success. Because if you're fighting the Jews in the land of Israel, if you're fighting the Jews in Judea as if they are the French in Algeria, the Jews are not going to respond to anti-colonial tactics like the French did to the Algerians in Algeria, because that's not who we are. So it's, number one, it's wrong and offensive. But number two, it's not helpful or useful.
Absolutely. So there is so much hate, ignorance, and misinformation being spread, especially online. How do you personally find a motivation to keep going amid all of this while Israel is actually at war and you being in Israel?
I'm speaking to you right now after coming back from a tour where I spoke with a lot of Jewish college students in North America. And, a lot of them are extremely anxious about this current political climate, about the increase of palpable and often very violent anti-Semitism. Understandably, they're worried about job prospects. They're worried about being accepted by their peers. And I understand all of that. I think it'd be incredibly insensitive not to understand and to empathize with it. That being said, what I told all of them is that history shows us that when anti-Semitism, when any form of hatred is left unchecked, it doesn't decrease, it only increases. So what motivates me is the knowledge that if we don't continue to speak up right now, this will just get worse. And if we feel that our ancestors, our recent ancestors, did us a disservice by not standing up loud and proud and galvanizing collective action 10 years ago, then in order for our descendants, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, for them to look back at us and say, thank you for the work that you did, we need to start right now. We need to continue and we need to be consistent. And that's what drives me.
And you're doing a great job, honestly.
Thank you.
What did you tell these students about, how to counter anti-Semitism when they're faced with it? What to do when they're in fear of going to campus or class or interacting with people that are not Jewish?
I told them that knowledge is the best way to become confident in articulating yourself, in engaging in debate, in being a spokesperson for the Jewish people, which is what they all effectively are, whether they like it or not, unfortunately.
Right.
And so, engaging in robust conversation and debate and discussion internally about some of these very pressing questions about the history of the Jewish state and the caricature of the Jewish people and the vision and aspirations we have for the future, both in the land and the diaspora, is incredibly important. Because then once we go out into the street and we're confronted by an anti-Semite, whether it's at a rally or in a classroom or in the school administration, we feel like we're really well armed to engage in that conversation. And I think it has to be done with an emphasis on really acquainting ourselves with the arguments of our enemies, but also the multitude of perspectives that exist within our own camp, so that we're able to not only articulate ourselves to a variety of audiences, but also to build bridges and alliances with potential partners.
I do completely agree, but at the same time, I do think it's sometimes difficult to enter into discussion either because people are violent, which then I would just suggest you remove yourself from that scene, or if they're just coming up with like misinformation that they've seen in a TikTok video. How would you deal with that?
Well, I think we have to be able to distinguish, who is a hateful bigot and who's really just parroting things from a place of ignorance or is really just asking questions. And I think generally, if we take, for example, a rally, I'm sure a lot of people have seen viral videos of people asking rally attendees which river and which sea, when they shout from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And you see that there really is the full gamut, right? From the people that are just hateful and hate Jews and hate the Jewish state because it's Jewish, and people that are ignorant and really just asking questions and arriving there because they're just assuming that this must align with their values because their friends that are attending align with them on their values on all these other different issues. And so I think we need to be able to stand proud and confident, unwavering in the face of the people that hate us, in the face of the haters, but at the same time, willing and able to engage in conversation with the people that are open to it. And I can tell you that this is certainly true for people that are, students on campus that want to advocate on behalf of the Jewish people. But it's also true for the military. I served in a unit in the IDF where we were really in the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict every single day, right where all of the action was. And, what that meant is not that you're engaged in, violent conflict with terrorists on a regular basis. That certainly happened quite often, but you're also engaged in conversation, in explanation, in de-escalation. And so we need to be both. We need to be warriors and we need to be poets. That requires a great deal of training. You don't just roll out of bed one day and know how to be a warrior poet. You got to develop those skills over time.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the role of parents of non-Jews, of government officials, institutions, universities, for people who are not Jewish? What should their roles be like? And what do you think, maybe that's a very big question, what do you think needs to be implemented on different society levels to counter anti-Semitism?
So I think we really need to invest time and infrastructure into building bridges with non-Jewish communities. Because frankly, and again, I've been involved in this general work of advocacy, activism for more than 10 years. And in the same period, I watched how, I'm not going to say the pro-Palestinian movement, but the pro-Hamas movement invested time, resources, and infrastructure in developing relationships with people that were far more likely to become our allies if we were to do the same. And so we really need to take the time to develop those personal relationships Because when I coach people about creating content on social media, I always tell them, it's very important after we've gone through all the different things that you need to do, all the steps you need to follow in creating a meaningful and moving piece of content. But if you don't have the personal relationships, right, even on social media, your content, the best content ever, will be stuck in an echo chamber.
Mm-hmm.
The way we break out of those echo chambers is by personal relationships, which then develop into communal relationships.
I find it fascinating because a lot of diaspora countries, I think especially in actually Central Europe, I would say a lot of these like government officials, they're not even aware that they have Jews amongst their citizens. It's very much an overlooked minority within a country usually, or people are not even aware that these people are Jewish, because they're not ultra orthodox, and you can't necessarily tell by how they look or how they dress or whatever. And I think that also needs to change. So I think education is usually a good starting point for that. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think, perhaps, Central Europe has a different set of issues than Western Europe and North America.
Mm-hmm.
But that's certainly the case, is that we cannot be complacent in terms of our activism. I think one of the issues in Western Europe and North America is that, politicians meet Jews all the time, lobbyists, fellow politicians, activists, but they're usually not presenting themselves as people that are advocating on behalf of the Jewish community. They're usually
Right.
there lobbying about climate issues or another minority community's rights or voting rights, whatever it is. And that's wonderful. But I think our Jewish community needs to reinvest itself in Jewish identity. And that means actually understanding that we're in a very precarious position right now, because for previous generations, we did not do that. Anti-Semitism didn't skyrocket in a vacuum. It skyrocketed, of course, because anti-Semitism is always going to exploit any opportunity to do so. But it also broke out because we did not organize to rise up against it and to build the coalitions that were necessary in order to confront it and call it out for what it is. So that's not to blame the Jews, but that is to certainly say that we know the anti-Semites are coming, right? The question, to paraphrase Ben Gurion, is, okay, what are the Jews going to do?
This attempt of a lot of people and a lot of Jews in the diaspora, from what I personally hear in stories with friends and new acquaintances, is that a lot of people are going through sort of an identity crisis because they kind of seem to suppress their Jewish heritage, if you want to call it that, in order to fit in more seamlessly, supposedly. And now they're kind of going through an identity crisis because they're realizing this actually might be an existential threat if we don't do something about it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's such a travesty because Jewish culture is cool. It's really cool. And so the fact that we've allowed it to become caricatured and demonized and made to seem lame in the minds of young Jews is a travesty. Because the whole world is inspired by Jewish culture. I just recently made a video about the new Bob Marley biopic, and the whole movie is just, completely full. It's teeming. It's seeping with Jewish identity and Jewish culture and aspirations. And, we've inspired entire religious movements and cultural moments. So we need to be investing in a revival of Jewish culture, making it mainstream and attractive, because it is.
Yeah. Funny enough, like when I tell people that I'm Israeli, I'm Jewish, their reaction is usually a bit like, "Oh, but you don't look like an alien." And I think that's where kind of a lot of the issues come from, because a lot of people seem to think that we're very different. We don't usually fit in, or we're kind of from outer space. And I think that's kind of part of the issue, which has kind of festered, over decades, I would say.
Yeah, I think a great, horrible example of that was, when Dave Chappelle, the comedian's space Jews joke, right? It quite, he quite literally painted the parallel between Jews and aliens from outer space. A colleague of mine recently confronted Dave Chappelle when he was doing stand-up and regurgitating some anti-Semitic ideas. And, one of the things that they walked away from that encounter with was, wow, he was really surprised at a lot of the things he was hearing. In other words, he had never had the opportunity to hear Jewish identity and culture and political aspirations articulated by a proud Jew that fully embodied that identity. And, we can fix that. We just need to have more Jews that are proud and fully embodying their identity, putting themselves forward in the public sphere in that manner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe you have noticed, and I would be interested to know what your personal experience and what you've witnessed was, because I do see, especially in Europe and also in the States, so mainly, let's say, overall in the West, I've seen a lot of people, Jews and non-Jews alike, politically drifting more to the right political side of the spectrum. Do you think that, because a lot of right wing politicians in various countries now do align with, protecting Jews and kind of standing in solidarity with Israel, more or less, even if just for ideological reasons. But a lot of it does seem very politically lobbyist kind of motivated. Do you think that there's a danger in diaspora Jews actually moving to the right or even far right political spectrum in voting? And do you think that there's sort of a limit to the narrative that they're using just
I
to align
do.
themselves with the Jews?
Yeah, I do. And I'm very concerned about it. That doesn't mean that I have a good answer for what we need to be doing, but
Hmm.
it's very concerning to me because at first, when I look at this issue, I have to think about the broad brushes of history and the relationship between the Jewish people and Western civilization and the relationship between the Islamic world and Western civilization. And for most of Jewish history, most of Jewish diaspora history, I should say, the Jews were the proverbial other in Europe, in the West, right? If there was an ethnic other, a religious other, that was the Jews,
Hmm.
right? And so as a result, we were basically the whipping boy of Europe and Christendom for thousands of years.
Hmm.
Now, the Islamic world featured very differently. They were the exterior foe. They were the competing civilization, the competing empire in its various forms, the various caliphates, the final one to collapse being the Ottoman Empire. And so as a result, the version of the caricature of the Muslim, of the Arab, of the Moor was one of the foreign conqueror or the foreign competitor. Whereas the Jew was the subjugated, weak, money grubbing, impoverished, domineering minority within the European society. And so right now we've seen things shift in a sense is that, the mass of Jewish people has, returned to the land of Israel. Others have migrated to more west to the Americas. And we've seen an influx of Muslim and Arab refugees and migrants into the European continent, into the inheritors of Christendom. And so we're seeing number one, a resurgence of this very ancient discomfort with the Islamic civilization, with Arab culture and identity, and also the asking for a relationship with the Jews as the familiar other as opposed to the foreign other, and saying like we want to go back to that type of situation because we feel less threatened by the Jews because we like the Jews when they're weak, as opposed to the Muslims, which we fear for their military might and all these other different caricatures of who Muslims are. And so I think that we need to be very careful with that because anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, they have this, relationship, this connected relationship, this intersection between them at the root. Jews were described as old as, Imperial Spain as being like Moors. Muslims were described by Imperial Spain and its inheritors as being like Jews. And so we have to be very careful because at the end of the day, a lot of these far right politicians that traffic in uber ultra nationalist tropes, they don't have a lot of kind things to say about the Jews, just like they don't have a lot of kind things to say about Muslims. That being said, just getting that part of the picture, one could, think, okay, so that means we need to go to the other direction. We can't go to the far right, let's go to the far left. But then we're seeing that the far left is becoming the darling of the Islamist movements, the ultra fundamentalist and extremist camps within the Islamic world. And we know that that is not the friend of the Jewish people either. So we're really caught between a rock and a hard place. So perhaps the best way forward is really cultivating a center with people that are not invested in ultranationalist politics from the Christian right, but are also fully aware of the dangers and the evils of fundamentalist Islam and Islamism.
Mm. Yeah, I completely agree. From all kinds of countries, there's a lot of people who tell me, Trump will win the election, or Le Pen in France. So these like ultra right Trump associated with the Proud Boys and so on. But as long as it fits their narrative, like the narrative when it comes to the Jews for right now and for Israel, that's what they're seeing. But that's a very, very selective viewpoint, I think, because long term, usually for me, as a pretty political person myself, as you said, I think it's very dangerous because, they might just take the stance to, maximize their voter base and maybe get in some Jewish voters that they might have not been able to, get on their side. Come after one minority, what are the chances that they're going to come after another? Long term, yeah, I think a center would be preferable.
Yeah, I think it's really important for us to understand what the ideological undercurrents of these political individuals are, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they're fantasizing about going back or creating an ethnically and religiously homogenous society, that's not going to end well for the Jews, right? And so right now, okay, the very clear and obvious threat to that homogenous vision are Muslim immigrants or Muslim fill in the blank, but in previous generations, in the case of like Le Pen, like we're talking about very recent generations,
Mm-hmm.
that antagonism was directed towards Jews, and so even if they are verbally or even tangibly supportive of Israel, we need to be very careful about that. And I think that Israelis, we need to be conscious of this as well. Because, just like our diaspora brothers have a responsibility to stand up for Israel and to demand, policies that treat Israel fairly and give support where support is due, we in Israel need to be looking out for our diaspora brothers and sisters and making sure that we're not, supporting politicians that will be advocating for their, marginalization in generations to come.
Mm-hmm. I had a lot of similar conversations when I was living in Israel with people who were big fans of Trump because they thought he was doing great things for Israel, which is very short-sighted, I think, personally.
It's difficult, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
we are in such an isolated mindset because we're constantly seeing politicians in various countries supporting us when it's convenient and then trashing us when it's convenient,
Right.
and so we come to a point where we're like, hey, we're getting support right now, we have to take advantage of it while we have it because this could disappear tomorrow. And it's very difficult in this context for us to think long term, but we have to do it. And when we demand that type of fully just treatment, right, because we deserve to have the recognition of our capital, just like we deserve not to be described as the people that are most appropriate to be running a bank or running somebody's investment portfolio or having certain tropes about money being lobbed at us. We deserve to have both fair treatment when it comes to the anti-Semitism which attacks the individual and anti-Semitism which attacks the Jewish collective, the Jewish state. And so we need to get into the habit of demanding both, standing up to receive both. And then politicians, the right politicians, will respond in kind.
Do you think the left, especially in the States with the Squad, Rashida Tlaib and Ocasio-Cortez and all these people, do you think, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but I'm not a big fan, do you think them aligning themselves with Hamas now, essentially, has anything to do with, that woke movement kind of supposedly supporting the underdog, which in this case they see as Palestinians? In fact, they're advocating for a terrorist organization, Hamas.
Absolutely. And I think it is interesting to see how, this ultra progressive wing of left politics in America, of democratic politics in America, really came to power, received their positions because they were advocating for a new form of politics which fully recognizes the legacy and the dangers of empire in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that comes from a good place because there are dangerous legacies of empire and racism and patriarchy, et cetera, in the U.S. that need to be dealt with responsibly.
Absolutely, yeah.
That being said, they have a glaring blind spot to the reality that theirs is not the only empire in human history, and it's also not the only empire that exists currently. So, railing against one empire while calling for the empowerment for the strengthening of another empire, which has just as much blood on its hands in the past and presently, is anti-progressive, in my opinion. And people within the progressive camp need to be the ones, first and foremost, to call that out.
Mm-hmm. It seems like it's down to not necessarily anymore supporting the supposed underdog, but really they're advocating a lot for minorities and communities and smaller groups and persecuted groups. But when it comes down to the Jews, it's a double standard that is applied.
It is. And I think that it's important for us to understand this is where Jewish people need to become very, very equipped to articulate the unique story of the Jewish people. Because, what is unique about the Jewish story isn't that we were and continue to be a marginalized minority. It's that we are a marginalized community that was kicked out of our homeland, like many communities were, exiled, displaced, but that continue to maintain that identity and connection to the original homeland. Because previous empires, every single time that they did that, they just shattered and destroyed those people. Yet when the Jewish people were shattered, we picked up the pieces. And what most of us recognize and call today Judaism, right? Which is basically a reconstructed form of Judean civilization. And so this is something which is very confusing to people that are just familiar with the imperial project of dispossessing, murdering, and displacing the Aboriginal community of Australia or the indigenous populations of New Zealand or of North America. It's a different story, right? It's one that most people are not familiar with if that's the only setting they understand that they're familiar with when it comes to decolonial politics. Ours, in that sense, is radically different. And it's also happening in a radically different setting than that of the West and Christendom and European Christian civilization, right? It happened in relation to civilizations which no longer exist today and the current empire of the Arab Islamic world. And so this is one which they're used to seeing only in the lens of being fellow ethno-religious minorities in the various countries that live in the West. But in our neck of the woods, in the Middle East and North Africa, that is the dominant identity. That is the identity which erased other identities in order to create structures of marginalization, of oppression. Mm-hmm. And so that's not to say that all Arabs and all Muslims and all of Islam is responsible for that, but it does mean to say, just like, for example, not all Europeans and Christians are responsible for, colonialism and racism and all of these things, but it does mean that we need our decolonial moment too. So if they do care about international moment of decolonization, then they need to be speaking to the ethno-religious minorities on the ground here in the Middle East, North Africa, which have different stories, but we do have, at the end of the day, shared interests, and that's the desire for indigenous liberation and the empowering of minorities all over the world.
So what a lot of people might be realizing, because they're now on TikTok or whatever, some people are surely not aware of that. If you do a lot of social media content, it takes a lot of energy, time, effort, and more. How are you personally looking after your mental health amid everything that is happening on the ground in Israel, around the world, and online as well?
I try and keep everything in perspective, right? Because, these are really tough times. There's no doubt about it. We're looking at, a level of anti-Semitism, violent anti-Semitism, which we haven't seen in 70 years. And that could be very harrowing. But I'm also constantly aware of the fact that, 75 years ago, we didn't have sovereignty anywhere. We didn't have self-determination. Our ancestors, wherever they were living, were a powerless minority that could only lobby other peoples in order to get equality and justice. And so we're in this unique position where we have unprecedented power, and power in a positive way, not in a way that we should be allowed to be demonized by those that hate us. We should celebrate our power, and unprecedented freedom in the countries of the West. And so we need to rise to the occasion, be inspired by this moment, and recognize that we are incredibly lucky in that sense to have been born in this generation. And we need to take advantage of that. But on a personal level, Jewish ritual is incredibly assuring. Engaging in things like tefillah and prayer and Jewish meditation. This roots me to my ancestors, and it makes me feel centered in dealing with the day-to-day challenges. And I think that we could all use ritual and connection to something greater than ourselves, to a purpose greater than ourselves in these trying times.
Mm. I think it's a little sad that it took this kind of a violent, barbaric attack and a war and all of this hate, especially online, for the larger Jewish community to come back together. But apparently, this is what it took.
Yeah, it is tragic. But unfortunately, it's also not uncommon if we just look at the trends of Jewish history. We tend to get complacent and to fight each other when the enemies aren't at the gates. And this was true about the Babylonians or surrounding the gates of Jerusalem. And this was true about the Maccabean revolution. What's unique about this moment is that we have social media. We have the ability to really revolutionize the way that we educate about Jewish history and identity. And so I do think that this is the unique tool for us to be able to break out of these cycles of Jewish history, to create something sustainable. And so that we don't have to have horribly traumatic events like this in order for us to wake up out of our stupor and unite to defend Jewish peoplehood.
I think this could be an important tip for our listeners because there's so much misinformation spread everywhere. How do you personally ensure that you find reliable sources for the advocacy you publish and the speeches that you give and so on?
Well, a general principle I would say is that look for multiple perspectives within the source, whether it's a video you're watching, a podcast you're listening to, or an article that you're reading, or a tweet on X or Threads. If you see that messaging is just one perspective, right? It doesn't give another perspective, even if it's like an abhorrent perspective, then that's probably not the best source. It might get a lot of clicks. It's probably not the best source of information. So looking for multiple sources, multiple perspectives, that is the key indicator that this is a solid piece of information. This is a solid source for understanding the full picture. And that's a general principle, but I would say very practically, check out my content. This is a shameless plug. And look at the content on Unpacked on the YouTube channel, which we have longer form content where we really dive into various questions and subjects. And we make sure, as a matter of principle, to always offer multiple perspectives, even when we vehemently disagree with them.
And that's incredibly valuable, I think. So on your channel, on your personal one, That Semite, which we will of course have linked in the show notes, you speak to a lot of the diverse population of Israel. If at all, how has the relationship between people, Jews, Muslim, Druze, and other people in Israel changed since October 7th?
I think the biggest shift has been the relationship between Arab Israelis and Arab identity. I think the last polls that showed record high of Arab Israelis identifying as Israeli was around like 2018, something around 2018, something around that period. And then unfortunately we had Guardians of the Wall, where we had unprecedented violence between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis throughout the major cities, throughout the mixed cities. And so that raised a lot of question marks, a lot of concern about the future of Arab Israeli identity and culture. But Hamas did, a credible service to Israeli identity when they decided that they weren't just coming after Jews. They went after Bedouin Israelis. They went after Arab Israelis from Eastern Jerusalem. They were indiscriminate in who they targeted with their bloodlust for spilling Jewish and Zionist adjacent blood. And so this sent a very powerful message to basically every Arab Israeli that their destinies are intertwined, are tied to that of the Jewish people in this land. And so what we're seeing from polls conducted by, I believe it was the Israeli Democracy Institute, that Arab Israelis are again identifying in record highs with Israel as Israelis and with the objectives of the current war against Hamas.
That's actually really nice to see and hear.
Yeah, it's an incredible beacon of hope for me because it's very easy to get caught up in the very painful moments of strife between the various tribes that make up Israeli society, whether it's between secular and religious Israelis, whether it's between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi, between Ethiopian and non-Ethiopian Israelis, between Arabs and Jews. But again, what we're seeing since the beginning of this war is an unbelievable moment of unity, of hope for the future, of what Israeli society is going to look like for the next 75 years.
Mm. Now I'd like to speak to maybe the parents of our listeners. How would you explain or talk to Jewish kids nowadays about what it means to be Jewish and why they might be facing a lot of hate because of who they are?
I love that question. I would say that you are the bearer of a 4,000-year-old identity. And as such, you have such an incredible legacy that you carry with you. Sometimes it might feel a little heavy, and sometimes people might look at you a little bit weird as you carry this legacy along with you. But it's also your source of strength. It's your source of power. That legacy has within it the ability to revolutionize the world, to change the world. And so even though it might be a little painful and some people might ridicule you for it, might attack you for it, drawing that power from it is what's going to give you the inspiration and the confidence to be fully you. Because at the end of the day, you cannot be separated from your Jewishness. So embrace it, love it, wear it on your chest with pride.
Oh, that was beautiful. Now, speaking of the hopeful end of this war at some point, what are you hoping for the future?
I hope to see Hamas's military capabilities completely destroyed. I hope to see our hostages that are still alive reunited with their families. And I hope to see a Gazan people liberated from tyrannical rule, that they will actually be able to develop a Palestinian culture and politics that is not based off of the negation of Israeli identity and Israeli political freedom. And I think that that can only happen by allowing the Palestinian people, the voices that have been outspoken for change, to be empowered and for them to create their own civil, social, and cultural movements. And for us to be supportive in engagement with them. You know, I would like to see out of the ashes of this war, and I'm saying ashes because it is such a horrific war in terms of the human toll. I would like to see a renewal of engagement between Israeli civilians and Palestinian civilians, because void of that, if we continue to speak in isolation to each other, there's no way to actually create a dialogue that can produce the type of framework we need for long-term peace and prosperity in this region.
Do you think it is possible for anyone from the outside or from within to change this kind of indoctrination of hate that Palestinians have been raised in? And if so, how would you go about changing their narrative that they've been taught towards Jews?
Well, frankly, one of the best tools for it, and I'll just take it to a very practical space, is that we can do this over social media. I create it used to be, I'm not sure what the numbers are right now, but half of my followers on TikTok were Palestinian. And, you know, I would get inundated every single day with messages from Palestinians that at the very least were expressing an astonishment that this is how Jews identify, that this is how we understand our identity. This is how we understand what we're doing in this land. And so that just speaks to the fact that, number one, the vast majority of Palestinians are living in their own echo chamber. You could compare that also to the way that majority of Israelis are also in our own echo chamber. But social media allows us to break out of that if we are technically smart, if we understand how the algorithm works, how these applications work, and then leverage specific technical things in order to break out of the echo chamber that these applications create and sustain, and then use that to create conversation, a nuanced conversation that acknowledges the humanity of the other. I think that that's a way that any one of us can start to break out of these echo chambers and start to have an impact on the other side. Because I could say that there's plenty of Palestinians that have done that to me. Like, just like I'm doing that, like I create a piece of content, which I'm directing towards Palestinians. And sometimes I'm asking them a question and I get a bunch of responses from them. Likewise, I get Palestinians that will create a piece of content which is directed towards me, and they're asking me a question and they want me to engage with them. I think that is the way forward before we actually have like a real institutional government-backed program that allows for these types of conversations to happen on a large scale, face to face.
Creating dialogue instead of two separate entities.
Yeah.
If there's one core message you would like for listeners to take from this episode, what would you like to tell them?
This moment is incredibly painful. We've just suffered one of the most traumatic events in Jewish history. Yet, at the same time, after every single traumatic moment in Jewish history, we've also been presented with a unique opportunity to create a revolutionary moment, to redefine publicly what it means to be a Jew in our generation, what is the message that we bring to humanity, and to create a better world. Because I think ultimately that is our purpose. That is the greater purpose. The purpose of Jewish peoplehood is not just to survive. Of course, we need to survive, and we need to fight to survive no matter what. But once we've survived, we have to have a message. So now's the time to remind ourselves within our communities what our message is, and to think about how we can articulate that in cultural means, on social media, in our communities, on our campuses, so that these ideas can get out there in a way that can have the impact that we all want.
Well, thank you so much for speaking on here, taking the time to so powerfully state your points. And I really appreciate you being on here.
Well, thank you for having me, Nina. This is wonderful.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Upfront Podcast. If you haven't already, give us a follow and join in the conversation on Instagram and Facebook at The Upfront Podcast. Take care and see you next time.